"Mom, you need to find a new place. Your landlord raised the rent again." I held my mother's trembling hands as she showed me another eviction notice, the fifth one this year from some faceless property management company. The smell of her lavender tea couldn't mask the fear in her voice as she whispered, "Ashley, I don't know what I did wrong. Every month it's something new. More money, new rules, threats." That night, alone in my apartment, I sat on my bedroom floor staring at the old brass house key from our childhood home, the one she kept in her jewelry box for 20 years after the divorce, wrapped in tissue paper like a sacred relic. She had no idea that her cruel, anonymous landlord who was slowly destroying her financially through systematic harassment was actually my father, Robert Thompson, the man who'd promised to love and protect her forever. My name is Ashley, and this is the story of how a childhood house key and a stack of property records revealed the darkest side of divorce revenge, and how sometimes a daughter has to choose between protecting her mother and confronting the father who raised her to believe family meant everything. Before I tell you how a house key and hidden ownership papers changed our family forever, subscribe and share this story with someone who knows what it's like to watch a parent suffer in silence. And please, comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with daughters and mothers from all over the world. What I discovered that night taught us that sometimes the cruelest wounds come from those who once promised to protect us. 3 days after seeing Mom's latest eviction notice, I found myself sprawled across my living room floor at 2 a.m, surrounded by a battlefield of printed documents that told a story of systematic cruelty I was only beginning to understand. The blue light from my laptop screen cast shadows across rental agreements, violation notices, and property tax records as I methodically pieced together 8 years of harassment that had slowly drained the joy from my mother's eyes. How could someone be so cruel to my mother? The question had been eating at me since Tuesday when I watched her hands tremble as she read aloud the latest threat. Tenant must remove all personal garden decorations within 48 hours or face immediate termination of lease. This wasn't just business. This was personal torture disguised as property management, and my real estate background was finally proving useful for something that mattered more than commission checks and closing dates. I'd started this investigation expecting to find a typical slumlord, maybe some greedy corporation squeezing every penny from tenants across Cedar Falls. Instead, I discovered something far more sinister, a pattern of harassment so specifically targeted at my mother that it felt like psychological warfare. The first red flag came when I cross-referenced other properties managed by Midwest Property Solutions. Mom's house was the only single-family rental in their portfolio. Every other property was a commercial building or multi-unit complex, which made no financial sense unless this company had specifically acquired one house for one particular tenant. My stomach twisted as I remembered Mom's voice from our Sunday phone call. "Ashley, they're making me submit written requests to water my own flowers." Who does that to a woman who's been teaching kindergarten for 30 years? The deeper I dug into public records, the more my chest tightened with a growing dread I couldn't name. Property transfer documents showed our childhood home had been sold to Midwest Property Solutions exactly 3 weeks after Mom and Dad's divorce was finalized, not the 6 months later like Mom believed. Someone had been planning this arrangement before the ink was even dry on their separation papers. I could smell the faint scent of Mom's chamomile lotion on my hands from when I'd hugged her goodbye yesterday, and the memory made me want to scream at the injustice of watching the kindest person I knew being systematically destroyed by faceless bureaucracy. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I pulled up violation notices from the past 2 years, each one more ridiculous than the last. Mom had been cited for excessive bird feeding when she scattered breadcrumbs for the cardinals Dad used to love watching. She'd been fined for unauthorized lawn ornaments when she planted sunflowers in the same spot where we'd grown them every summer of my childhood. The property management company had even threatened eviction because her mailbox was painted non-regulation blue, the exact same shade she and Dad had chosen together when they bought the house 23 years ago. Every violation felt like someone was erasing the history of our family, one arbitrary rule at a time. As I organized the documents chronologically, a chilling timeline emerged that made my hands go numb. The harassment had escalated each year, perfectly timed to coincide with significant dates. Rent increases always came the week of Mom and Dad's anniversary, violation notices arrived every Christmas morning, and eviction threats materialized like clockwork on Mom's birthday. This wasn't random corporate greed. This was someone who knew our family calendar, someone who understood exactly which dates would cause maximum emotional damage. The vanilla candle I'd lit hours ago had burned down to a puddle of wax, filling my apartment with the same scent Mom used in our old bathroom, and suddenly I was 8 years old again, listening to my parents argue through thin walls about money they didn't have. I pulled up the business registration for Midwest Property Solutions, and my cursor hovered over the corporate officers, linked like a loaded gun. Part of me already knew what I was going to find, but my brain refused to accept the possibility until I could see the truth in black and white. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, leaving a bitter film on my tongue that matched the growing fear in my throat. Mom trusted me to help her figure this out. She'd said I was the only one who understood business stuff and could make sense of all the legal language designed to confuse and intimidate her. What she didn't know was that I was starting to suspect the person behind her suffering wasn't a stranger at all, but someone who'd once promised to love and protect our family forever. My real estate training had taught me to follow paper trails and trust documentation over emotions, but nothing had prepared me for the possibility that I might be investigating my own father. Before all the lawyers and late-night tears, before the systematic harassment and eviction notices, that house at 247 Maple Street was where magic lived and dreams felt possible, where the smell of Mom's Saturday morning pancakes mixed with the sound of Dad's off-key singing in the shower created a symphony of safety I thought would last forever. I closed my laptop and let myself remember the weight of Dad's calloused hands teaching me to ride my bike in our gravel driveway, how he'd run behind me for what felt like hours until that moment when I realized he'd let go and I was flying solo, his proud laughter echoing off the white picket fence he'd built with his own hands the summer I turned 7. Those were the days when Robert Thompson was my hero, not because he was perfect, but because he showed up. 4 dance recitals where he sat in the front row with a bouquet of gas station roses, 4 middle school science fairs where he helped me build volcanoes that actually erupted, 4 lazy Sunday afternoons when we'd sprawl across the living room floor playing Monopoly while Mom dozed on the couch with her romance novel spread across her chest. The house itself seemed to breathe with our happiness then, every room holding memories that felt permanent. The kitchen where Dad would spin Mom around while she cooked dinner, both of them laughing like teenagers as I rolled my eyes and pretended their love was embarrassing instead of the most beautiful thing I'd ever witnessed. I could still picture Mom's face when Dad surprised her with a sunflower garden for their 10th anniversary, how she cried happy tears as he explained that sunflowers always turn toward the light, just like she taught him to do during his darkest moments at the auto plant when layoffs threatened our security and his pride. The basement was Dad's kingdom, filled with the scent of sawdust and WD-40, where he built me a dollhouse replica of our actual home, complete with tiny furniture and miniature family figures that looked just like us. A project that took him 6 months of secret evening work because he wanted it perfect for my 9th birthday. Winter evenings meant hot chocolate with too many marshmallows while we watched old movies together. All 3 of us piled on the sectional sofa Dad had bought used but reupholstered himself, Mom's feet tucked under his leg, while I claimed the entire middle cushion for my ongoing art projects that somehow always involved glitter and Mom's good scissors. The master bedroom was their sanctuary, but also the place where I'd crawl between them during thunderstorms, feeling invincible sandwiched between the 2 people who'd created a world where I was safe, loved, and never questioned whether I belonged. Even our tiny upstairs bathroom held treasures. The height marks Dad penciled on the doorframe every birthday, the medicine cabinet where Mom kept special Band-Aids with cartoon characters for my inevitable childhood scrapes, the window where we'd sit together watching storms roll across the Wisconsin farmland that stretched beyond our backyard like a green ocean of possibility. Christmas mornings transformed our living room into a wonderland where Dad's excitement matched mine as we tore through wrapping paper while Mom documented everything with her ancient camera, the flash creating moments of pure joy that she'd later paste into photo albums with handwritten captions like Ashley's first bicycle and Robert trying to assemble the impossible playhouse. Those photo albums were probably still somewhere in Mom's bedroom, filled with evidence of a love story that seemed unbreakable, a family portrait that looked like it belonged in a magazine advertising the American dream. How do you reconcile those memories with a man who would systematically torture the woman who'd given him the best years of her life, who by back the house where their daughter learned to walk, just so he could weaponize it against the mother who still kept his favorite coffee mug in her kitchen cabinet, unable to throw away even the smallest reminder of the man who'd once made her believe in forever. The first crack in our perfect family portrait appeared during my sophomore year of college when I came home for Thanksgiving break and found Dad's workshop in the basement completely gutted. Every tool, every project, every trace of his presence scraped away like he'd never existed, leaving behind only rectangular dust shadows on the concrete walls where his workbench had stood for 15 years. When did love turn into revenge? I should have recognized the warning signs earlier. The way Dad's voice turned ice cold whenever Mom's name came up in conversation, how he'd change the subject with surgical precision if I mentioned her new job at the elementary school or her volunteer work at the animal shelter, as if acknowledging her continued existence was a personal betrayal of his carefully constructed narrative where she was the villain in their love story's demise. The divorce proceedings had dragged on for 18 brutal months, transforming my parents from soulmates into gladiators fighting over every shared memory, every piece of furniture, every photograph that contained evidence of the 23 years they'd spent building a life together. I remember sitting in the mediator's sterile conference room during winter break, watching my father's jaw clench as he demanded Mom return the Christmas ornaments they'd collected during their annual trips to Door County, each delicate glass bauble representing a December when they'd been happy, when their biggest fight was whether to get a real tree or an artificial one. Mom's lawyer had advised her to fight for the house. It was her biggest asset, her only security after spending 2 decades as a homemaker who'd sacrificed her teaching career to raise me and support Dad's advancement at the manufacturing plant. But I watched something die in her eyes when Dad's attorney presented their counteroffer. He'd keep the house and pay her a settlement that would force her to start over in a cramped apartment across town, miles away from the neighborhood where she'd built friendships and established roots. The negotiation felt like watching surgeons dissect a body, each decision carving away another piece of the life they'd created together, until all that remained were legal documents and bitter accusations about who deserved what percentage of their shared history. Dad's transformation accelerated after the final papers were signed, as if the man who'd once slow danced with Mom in our kitchen while dinner burned on the stove had been replaced by a stranger who spoke exclusively in calculated cruelties designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. He'd call me at school with updates about your mother's situation, his voice dripping with false concern as he described her struggles to afford groceries on her substitute teacher's salary, her failed attempts to maintain the garden he'd helped her plant, the way she'd aged 10 years in the 6 months since their separation became final. There was something predatory in how he collected information about her vulnerabilities, filing away details about her loneliness, her financial stress, her desperate attempts to maintain dignity while rebuilding her identity as a single woman approaching 50. The man who'd once driven through a blizzard to bring her soup when she had the flu now seemed to take pleasure in cataloging her suffering, as if her pain was proof that leaving him had been the biggest mistake of her life. I started avoiding his phone calls after he told me about driving past her new apartment and seeing her eating dinner alone by the window, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made my stomach turn with recognition that this wasn't grief anymore. It was something darker, more deliberate, more dangerous. The worst part was how he'd frame his cruelty as concern, how he'd shake his head sadly while describing Mom's poor choices and inability to move forward, as if he wasn't actively working to ensure her failure, as if he hadn't become the kind of man who would weaponize love against the woman who'd given him everything she had to give. During my junior year, when Mom mentioned she was renting our childhood home from some property management company, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with Wisconsin's brutal winter, because I knew my father well enough to recognize his handiwork even when it was disguised as corporate policy. But I pushed that suspicion down, unwilling to believe that the man who taught me to change a tire and tie my shoes could be capable of such calculated psychological warfare against the woman who still kept his favorite coffee mug in her kitchen cabinet, who still smiled sadly whenever our old song played on the radio, who still believed somewhere deep in her heart that the Robert Thompson she'd married was just buried somewhere inside the stranger he'd become. Looking back through the lens of adult understanding, I can now see how masterfully my mother orchestrated the illusion that she was fine, how she painted over her pain with the same careful precision she used to cover crayon marks on our childhood walls, transforming every phone call into a performance designed to protect me from witnessing the systematic destruction of her spirit that was happening in real time. She protected me from seeing his cruelty the same way her own mother had shielded her from her father's alcoholism 30 years earlier, because that's what women in our family do. We absorb the blows meant for those we love, we smile through tears, we pretend strength when we're breaking apart, and we carry secrets that would destroy our children's faith in the goodness of the world. Every Sunday phone call was a masterclass in maternal deception. She'd wait until her voice was steady before dialing my number, probably splashing cold water on her face to reduce the puffiness around her eyes, arranging her words like flowers in a vase so that even her complaints sounded optimistic. "Oh, honey, you know how it is with landlords." She'd laugh when I asked about the latest rent increase, that forced brightness in her tone that I now recognize as the sound of a woman drowning while pretending she's just treading water. When I'd offer to visit and help her deal with the property management company, she'd deflect with questions about my job, my dating life, my plans for the holidays, anything to redirect my attention away from her increasingly desperate circumstances. The few times I did make it home to Cedar Falls, I noticed things she couldn't hide. The way her hands shook slightly when opening mail, how she'd gotten thinner each visit, the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could completely mask, the prescription bottles tucked discreetly behind the coffee maker where she thought I wouldn't see them. Her medicine cabinet told a story of stress-induced illness, antacids for the stomach problems that started after the divorce, sleeping pills for the insomnia that came with financial terror, blood pressure medication for a woman who'd never had health problems until she started living under the constant threat of homelessness. She'd moved all of Dad's photos to a box in her bedroom closet, but I caught her sometimes staring at the empty spots on the mantel where their wedding picture used to sit, her face carrying the bewildered expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The kitchen where she'd once sung while cooking dinner had become a place of careful rationing, her meals growing smaller and simpler as each rent increase consumed more of her substitute teacher's salary that barely covered basic survival. I found grocery lists in her handwriting that broke my heart. Bread, store brand. Peanut butter, if on sale. Ramen, enough for a week. Each item representing another compromise in a life that was slowly shrinking around her like walls closing in. She started volunteering extra hours at the animal shelter, not just because she loved helping abandoned pets find homes, but because it meant free dinner on weekdays, and a place to go where she felt useful instead of like a burden on a world that seemed determined to erase her existence. The worst part was how she apologized for everything, for calling me too often, for needing help understanding legal documents, for crying when she thought I couldn't hear her through the bathroom door, as if her pain was an inconvenience to everyone around her instead of a natural response to systematic emotional torture. She'd inherited this tendency from her own mother, who'd spent 40 years making excuses for my grandfather's drinking, who taught her daughter that a woman's job was to absorb a man's anger and transform it into something bearable for the children, who'd passed down the dangerous lesson that love sometimes looks like accepting unacceptable treatment. When Mom talked about her difficult landlord, I could hear echoes of her mother's voice describing her father as going through a rough patch. That same willingness to humanize cruelty, to find reasonable explanations for unreasonable behavior, to protect the family's image even when it meant sacrificing her own well-being. She was repeating a generational pattern of women who smile in public while dying in private, who prioritize everyone else's comfort over their own survival, who believe their worth is measured by how much suffering they can endure without complaining. I should have recognized the signs sooner, should have insisted on seeing the lease agreements and violation notices, should have trusted my instincts when her stories about property management incompetence started sounding more like deliberate harassment, but she was so skilled at deflection, so practiced at minimizing her pain, that I almost believed her performance was reality. The documents spread across my coffee table told a story of calculated cruelty that would have impressed a military strategist. Each violation notice and rent increase timed with surgical precision to inflict maximum psychological damage during moments when Mom was most vulnerable, creating a paper trail of systematic torture that stretched back 8 years like a roadmap of deliberate destruction. Stack of notices, Mom's tears, sleepless nights. These had become the rhythm of her existence since the divorce, though I was only now understanding how methodically orchestrated her suffering had been by someone who knew exactly which emotional buttons to push and when to push them. The earliest documents showed almost reasonable behavior: modest rent increases that aligned with market rates, standard lease terms that any tenant might expect, nothing that would raise red flags or suggest anything beyond typical landlord-tenant business relationships. But as I organized the papers chronologically, a sinister pattern emerged that made my hands tremble with recognition of how someone had weaponized bureaucracy against a woman who trusted legal documents and followed rules because she'd been raised to believe the system would protect people who played by its guidelines. Year 2 brought the first signs of targeted harassment. Rent increases that jumped 30% overnight with 30 days' notice, violation citations for excessive window decorations, when Mom hung the same Christmas wreaths she displayed for decades, fines for unauthorized pet feeding, when she scattered birdseed for the cardinals that had nested in our backyard maple tree since I was 8 years old. I could smell the faint scent of Mom's vanilla hand lotion on the papers where she'd handle them with shaking fingers, probably reading each notice multiple times while trying to understand what she'd done wrong, why her quiet existence had suddenly become a series of infractions worthy of legal action. The third year's documents revealed an escalation that felt personal: eviction threats filed every December, always withdrawn at the last minute but timed perfectly to ruin Christmas morning, rent increases scheduled for the anniversary of her divorce, violation notices that arrived like clockwork on her birthday with complaints about lawn maintenance that had never been issues before. Each piece of paper represented hours of Mom's life spent crying at her kitchen table, frantically calculating whether she could afford another increase, apologizing to me during phone calls for needing help understanding legal language designed to confuse and intimidate rather than inform. The tactile memory of hugging her last Sunday flooded back as I touched the crumpled edges of a particularly cruel notice that had demanded she remove the bird bath Dad had installed for their 15th anniversary. The same bird bath where I'd scattered breadcrumbs every morning during childhood summers, watching robins and blue jays create a symphony that Mom said reminded her why she loved living in Wisconsin. Years 4 and 5 showed a pattern of harassment so specifically targeted it felt like psychological warfare. Noise complaints filed against a woman who lived alone and rarely spoke above a whisper, citations for excessive garden gnomes when she displayed the single ceramic rabbit I'd given her for Mother's Day, demands that she repaint the front door every 6 months in different shades that never seemed to meet the property management company's mysteriously changing standards. I found receipts stapled to violation notices showing Mom had spent thousands of dollars trying to comply with increasingly absurd demands: professional lawn care for a yard she'd maintained herself for 2 decades, pest control treatments for problems that didn't exist, property improvements that were immediately followed by citations claiming the work hadn't been done correctly. The paper felt rough against my fingertips as I traced the timeline of her financial destruction, each receipt representing money she couldn't afford to spend, savings account withdrawals that pushed her closer to complete destitution while she tried desperately to remain the compliant tenant she'd been raised to believe she should be. The most recent documents revealed the full scope of the harassment campaign: daily violation notices for infractions, so minor they bordered on comedy if they weren't destroying my mother's mental health, threats of immediate eviction for having mail delivered 1 day late, demands that she submit written requests to water her own flowers or face lease termination. I could picture her sitting at her kitchen table each evening, reading these notices by the light of the brass lamp Dad had bought her for their 10th anniversary, probably wondering if she was losing her mind, if normal people receive this kind of treatment from their landlords, if maybe she really was the problem tenant these documents portrayed her to be. The smell of my cold coffee mixed with the frustration building in my chest as I realized someone had spent 8 years systematically destroying my mother's sense of reality, convincing her that she deserved this treatment, that she was somehow deficient as a tenant, as a woman, as a human being worthy of basic respect and dignity. I reached into my jewelry box and pulled out the small brass key that Mom had pressed into my palm during my college graduation party, its metal surface worn smooth by 20 years of holding on to memories that felt too precious to abandon, even when they become sources of pain rather than comfort. The weight of it familiar against my skin like a talisman that connected me to a version of our family that existed before lawyers and legal documents had carved up our happiness into measurable assets. 20 years of holding on to memories. That's what this key represented. 2 decades of Mom keeping a symbol of home in her most sacred space, wrapped in the same tissue paper she'd used to protect her grandmother's pearl earrings, because some things are too important to throw away even when they no longer serve their original purpose. The key had originally opened the front door of 247 Maple Street back when it was our house, our sanctuary, our proof that Robert Thompson could provide for his family and give his wife the white picket fence dream she described during their teenage courtship, but now it unlocked nothing except the flood of memories that made my chest ache with recognition of how completely everything had changed. I could still remember the ceremony when Dad presented this key to Mom during their first Christmas in the house, how he'd wrapped it in a tiny jewelry box and made a speech about how she held the key to his heart and now she'd hold the key to their home. Both of them crying happy tears while I complained about how gross their romance was because I was 7 and didn't understand that I was witnessing something rare and beautiful that most people spend their whole life searching for. The brass felt cold against my palm as I closed my fingers around it, thinking about how Mom had carried this key in her purse for 15 years after the divorce became final, not because she had any delusion about returning to the house, but because letting go of it would mean accepting that the life she built there was truly over, that the man who'd given it to her had become someone who would use her attachment to that place as a weapon against her. I pressed the key's sharp edges into my palm until they left small indentations, using the physical discomfort to anchor myself in the present moment, while my mind reeled with the possibility that the property records I was about to search might reveal something that would destroy what little faith I still had in the concept of family loyalty. The key smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Mom kept in her jewelry box, mixing her scent with the metallic tang of old brass and the ghost of machine oil from Dad's hands when he'd first handed it to her 23 years ago, back when his calloused fingers represented security instead of the unknown threat they might have become. I could picture her looking at this key during the worst moments of the past 8 years, maybe holding it while she read violation notices and eviction threats, drawing comfort from its solid weight even as the house it once opened was being used to systematically destroy her peace of mind by someone who remained faceless and anonymous in official correspondence. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was holding the key to Mom's former home while preparing to investigate whether her current suffering was connected to the man who'd originally given her both the key and the promise that she'd always have a place where she belonged, where she was safe, where love lived in every room and every corner held evidence of a family that had chosen each other over and over again. My laptop screen reflected the overhead light as I prepared to enter the property address into the county records database, and suddenly the key felt heavier in my hand, as if it was absorbing the weight of whatever truth I was about to discover, whatever betrayal might be hiding behind corporate names and legal documents designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Part of me wanted to put the key back in its tissue paper wrapping and close the jewelry box, to call Mom and tell her I couldn't help with her landlord problems, to protect myself from learning something that might change how I understood my own childhood and the man who taught me to ride a bike and build snowmen, and believe that fathers were heroes who protected their families from all the cruelty in the world. But I could hear Mom's voice from our last phone call, the barely controlled desperation when she'd said, "Ashley, I don't know how much more of this I can take." And I knew that my comfort mattered less than her survival, that sometimes love means facing truths that will break your heart if it means protecting someone who can't protect themselves. The key's metal had warmed from my body heat, and I realized I'd been holding it for almost 10 minutes while staring at my laptop screen, gathering courage for a search that might reveal my father as the architect of my mother's systematic destruction. My cursor trembled over the search property records, button for what felt like an eternity, before I finally clicked it and watched the screen populate with information that would shatter every assumption I'd held about my father's capacity for cruelty, the official county records displaying in stark black and white text that 247 Maple Street had been purchased by Midwest Property Solutions, LLC on March 15, 2016, exactly 3 weeks after Robert James Thompson and Linda Marie Thompson's divorce decree was finalized in the Winnebago County Courthouse. How could he do this to her? The question exploded in my mind as I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with tears I didn't realize were falling until they landed on my keyboard, each drop carrying the weight of understanding that my father had planned this psychological torture campaign before Mom had even finished packing her belongings from their shared bedroom, before she'd signed the lease on her tiny apartment across town, before she'd had time to grieve the death of her 23-year marriage. The smell of my vanilla candle mixed with the salt of my tears as I scrolled down to the corporate officers section, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird, desperate to escape the truth that was materializing on my laptop screen with the cold precision of legal documentation. Robert J. Thompson, president and primary shareholder. The words burned into my retinas like a brand, followed by an address I recognized as Dad's new condo complex across town. The same luxury building where he'd moved after the divorce with his younger girlfriend, who drove a red convertible and laughed too loudly at his jokes during the awkward dinners, where he tried to convince me that Linda Thompson had been holding him back from his full potential. I clicked through 8 years of property transfer documents, each page revealing another layer of premeditation that made my stomach lurch with the recognition that this wasn't a spontaneous act of post-divorce bitterness, but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to break Mom's spirit so completely that she'd beg him to take her back, or destroy herself trying to maintain her independence. The business license for Midwest Property Solutions had been filed 2 months before the divorce papers, meaning Dad had been planning this revenge fantasy while still sharing a bed with Mom, while still kissing her goodbye each morning, while still pretending to be the loving husband who brought her coffee in bed and complained about property taxes like any normal suburban father worried about providing for his family. My hands shook as I pulled up the financial records that showed how he'd structured the purchase, using his 401k withdrawal and the equity from selling his collection of vintage motorcycles he'd claimed were stolen during the divorce proceedings, laundering his assets through a shell company specifically designed to hide his identity from the woman who'd spent 2 decades managing their household budget and would have immediately recognized his purchasing patterns. The corporate filings revealed that Midwest Property Solutions existed for exactly one purpose: to own and manage a single residential property at 247 Maple Street, making it the most expensive revenge plot in Cedar Falls history. A multi-$100,000 investment in psychological warfare against a kindergarten teacher who still kept his favorite coffee mug in her kitchen cabinet because throwing it away felt like admitting their love had been a lie. I scrolled through the correspondence between the property management company and their tenant, recognizing Dad's voice in every coldly worded violation notice, his handwriting disguised by corporate letterhead but his cruelty unmistakable in the systematic escalation of demands designed to make Mom feel like she was losing her mind, like she was the problem, like she deserved this treatment because she'd been foolish enough to believe that divorce meant freedom instead of a more sophisticated form of imprisonment. The rental agreement Mom had signed 8 years ago included clauses that gave the landlord unprecedented control over her daily life, approval required for any decorative changes, mandatory inspections with 24 hours notice, immediate eviction for any violation regardless of how minor, rental increases at the discretion of management with minimal notice, all wrapped in legal language that made these abusive terms sound like standard business practices instead of the psychological torture they actually represented. I found email threads between Dad and the property management company he'd hired to act as his proxy, his instructions spelled out in corporate speak that barely disguised his personal vendetta. Please ensure tenant compliance with all aesthetic guidelines. Monitor property for unauthorized modifications. Enforce lease terms strictly to maintain property value. Each directive a thinly veiled command to make Mom's life as miserable as possible without giving her grounds to break the lease and escape his control. The breaking point wasn't just seeing his name on the ownership documents. It was understanding that every tear Mom had cried, every sleepless night she'd spent worrying about money, every moment she felt like a failure as a tenant had been orchestrated by the man who'd once promised to love and protect her until death did them part, who'd turned their shared history into ammunition for a war she didn't even know she was fighting. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating after I closed my laptop and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The familiar comfort of my own space transformed into a prison where every shadow seemed to mock my naivety, where the ticking of my kitchen clock sounded like a countdown to some inevitable confrontation that would force me to choose between the father who'd raised me and the mother who was slowly dying under his systematic cruelty. Empty apartment, cold truth, moral conflict. These became my companions as I paced from room to room at 4 a.m, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floors Dad had helped me refinish when I'd first bought this place, Back when I still believed he was the kind of man who showed love through acts of service instead of calculated psychological warfare designed to destroy the woman who'd given him the best years of her life. I could taste the metallic fear in my mouth as I replayed every conversation I'd had with both parents over the past 8 years, recognizing now how masterfully Dad had played his role as the concerned ex-husband who worried about Linda's poor decision-making and inability to manage money. How he'd positioned himself as the voice of reason while systematically creating the very problems he pretended to observe with such manufactured sadness. The heating system kicked on with a mechanical sigh that echoed my own exhaustion, filling the apartment with warm air that couldn't touch the cold realization settling in my bones that I'd been an unwitting accomplice in Mom's torture, nodding sympathetically when Dad expressed his concerns about her living situation, even agreeing with his assessment that she seemed unstable and overwhelmed, without understanding that he was the architect of her overwhelm, the engineer of her instability. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger with red-rimmed eyes and hollow cheeks, someone who looked like she'd aged 10 years in a single evening of discovery, and I splashed cold water on my face while wondering how many other daughters had stood in bathrooms at dawn trying to reconcile the father they'd worshipped with the monster hiding behind corporate letterhead and shell companies. The coffee I'd brewed hours earlier sat untouched on my nightstand, its surface covered with a film that reminded me of the way Mom's eyes had looked during our last visit, clouded with exhaustion and confusion, struggling to understand why her simple existence had become such a series of insurmountable obstacles that seemed to multiply faster than she could solve them. I pulled the brass key from my pocket and held it up to the window where the first hints of sunrise were painting the sky pink and orange, colors that reminded me of the sunrises Dad and I used to watch together during our Saturday morning fishing trips, when I still believed he was teaching me about patience and perseverance instead of demonstrating how to manipulate situations to achieve desired outcomes. The weight of genetic inheritance pressed down on my shoulders as I wondered what other cruelties might be lurking in my DNA, what capacity for calculated revenge I might have inherited from a man who could spend 8 years systematically destroying someone he'd once loved enough to marry, to build a home with, to create a child with during moments when their bodies and souls had been aligned in the kind of intimacy that produces human life. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mom sent at 3:47 a.m. "Can't sleep, sweetie. Don't worry about me. Love you." And I realized she was probably lying awake in her bed right now, staring at the ceiling of a house that had once been her sanctuary but had become her prison, unaware that her sleeplessness was being monitored and probably celebrated by the man who'd promised to forsake all others for her, who'd stood in a church and vowed to love her in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death parted them. The moral weight of my discovery felt like trying to breathe underwater. Every attempt to find clarity met with the suffocating pressure of understanding that confronting Dad would destroy our relationship forever, while staying silent would make me complicit in Mom's continued suffering. A choice between protecting my own emotional comfort and saving the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise me with enough love and security that I'd grown up believing the world was basically good and people were fundamentally decent. I opened my laptop and stared at the property records again, hoping maybe I'd misread something. Maybe there was an explanation that didn't involve my father being a sociopath who'd weaponized bureaucracy against his ex-wife. But the black and white text remained unchanged, as permanent and damning as a death certificate for the version of Robert Thompson I'd carried in my heart since childhood. The brass key grew warm in my palm as I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the conversation that would happen when I confronted him, tried to picture his face when I laid out the evidence of his 8-year campaign of psychological terrorism, tried to prepare myself for the possibility that he might be proud of his ingenuity instead of ashamed of his cruelty, that he might defend his actions as justified revenge against a woman who dared to leave him despite his generosity and provision. The property management company's phone number stared back at me from my laptop screen like an accusation, and I found myself dialing it at 6 a.m., even though I knew their offices wouldn't open for hours, my hands shaking as I listened to the automated voicemail message that cheerfully informed me that Midwest Property Solutions values your call and wants to provide exceptional service to all our valued tenants and property owners, the corporate speak masking the reality that this company existed solely to torture my mother while protecting my father's identity from legal consequences. Phone calls, Paper trails, shocking connections. These became my obsession as I spent the morning methodically unraveling the web of deception Dad had constructed to hide his involvement, starting with the business address listed on the corporate filings that led me to a strip mall office building where Midwest Property Solutions rented a single room next to a tax preparation service and a nail salon, the kind of anonymous location designed for companies that needed a physical address but never intended to conduct actual business from the premises. I called the building management company and pretended to be a potential client looking to lease office space, learning from a chatty receptionist that the Midwest Property Solutions office was rarely occupied except for a middle-aged man who came in once a month to collect mail and sign documents, someone she described as polite but secretive, who always paid his rent in cash and never made small talk with other tenants in the building. The paper trail led me to the management company Dad had hired to serve as his operational proxy, Complete Property Services, LLC, a legitimate business that handled dozens of rental properties across Wisconsin but had been specifically contracted to manage only one residential unit for Midwest Property Solutions, an arrangement that should have raised red flags if anyone had been paying attention to the unusual nature of this client relationship. I spent 3 hours on the phone with various county offices, following a trail of business licenses and tax filings that revealed how carefully Dad had constructed this revenge apparatus, using shell companies and third-party managers to create multiple layers of separation between himself and the daily harassment that was destroying Mom's mental health while protecting him from any legal liability if she ever decided to fight back against her mysterious tormentor. The breakthrough came when I called Complete Property Services directly and spoke with a customer service representative who accidentally revealed more than she intended during what should have been a routine inquiry about property management procedures for landlords living out of state. "Oh, you're asking about the Thompson property," she said, her voice brightening with recognition before she caught herself and tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. She'd connected my father's name directly to the house where my mother was being systematically tormented, confirming what the legal documents had already told me but making it feel more real, more personal, more devastating. I pressed her for details, claiming to be a real estate investor interested in similar management arrangements, and learned that Robert Thompson had been what they called a hands-on client who provided extremely detailed instructions about tenant interactions, lease enforcement, and property maintenance standards that far exceeded their normal protocols for residential management. The representative mentioned that Mr. Thompson called their office weekly to review violation reports and rent collection status, that he'd specifically requested immediate notification of any late payments or lease infractions, and that he'd instructed them to interpret the lease terms strictly and without exception, regardless of tenant circumstances or hardship, painting a picture of obsessive monitoring that felt more like stalking than property management. My stomach churned as I realized that every violation notice Mom had received, every rent increase that had pushed her closer to financial ruin, every arbitrary rule change that had made her question her own sanity had been personally reviewed and approved by my father, who was probably sitting in his luxury condo each week reading reports about her suffering like they were entertainment instead of evidence of a human being's systematic destruction. The most shocking connection came when I cross-referenced the timing of major harassment escalations with significant dates in our family history, discovering that the cruelest violation notices and eviction threats were always filed within days of Mom's birthday, their wedding anniversary, my graduation dates, and holidays when she might have been feeling particularly vulnerable and isolated, suggesting that Dad had been using his intimate knowledge of her emotional calendar to maximize the psychological impact of his bureaucratic warfare. I found email threads between Dad and the property management company where he'd specifically requested that certain violations be timed to coincide with what he called emotionally significant dates, claiming this would encourage better tenant compliance, when what he really meant was that hitting her when she was already sad would cause maximum damage to her self-worth and stability. The phone calls I made that morning revealed a network of professionals who'd been unknowingly complicit in psychological abuse, from the maintenance workers who'd been sent to document violations that didn't exist to the lawyers who drafted lease agreements designed to give a landlord unprecedented control over a tenant's daily life, all of them believing they were working for a legitimate property management company instead of facilitating a revenge fantasy that had consumed 8 years of my father's life and nearly destroyed my mother's will to live. The brass key burned against my palm as I sat in my car outside Dad's condo complex at 7:30 a.m., my engine running because I couldn't decide whether to park and confront him or drive away and pretend I'd never discovered the truth about his 8-year campaign of psychological warfare against the woman who'd given him the best years of her life, who'd stood by him through job losses and family deaths and moments when his own father's alcoholism had threatened to pull him into the same destructive patterns that had defined his childhood in ways that made his current cruelty feel like a generational curse he'd chosen to embrace rather than break. Do I protect Mom or confront Dad? The question ricocheted through my mind like a bullet, each consideration carrying the weight of potential destruction. Confronting him would mean accepting that my childhood had been built on the foundation of a lie, that the man who taught me to change my oil and balance my checkbook was capable of torture disguised as property management, that every proud moment we'd shared during my adolescence had been contaminated by his capacity for calculated revenge against someone who dared to leave him despite his provision and protection. I pressed the key's sharp edges deeper into my skin until they left small crescents of pain that anchored me to the present moment, while my mind spiraled through scenarios that all ended in some form of family apocalypse. Telling Mom the truth would destroy her faith in her own judgment and force her to confront the reality that she'd been fighting a war she didn't know existed against an enemy who'd once promised to love and cherish her until death parted them, while confronting Dad directly would mean watching his face transform from the mask of concern he'd worn for 8 years into whatever expression sociopaths make when their carefully constructed facades crumble under the weight of evidence they can't deny or explain away. The luxury building where Dad lived with his new girlfriend rose in front of me like a monument to his post-divorce success, paid for with the same money he could have used to leave Mom alone instead of purchasing our childhood home specifically to weaponize it against her. And I wondered if his girlfriend knew she was sleeping next to a man who spent his evenings reviewing violation reports about his ex-wife's garden gnome placement and late rent payments like they were stock portfolios, requiring his personal attention and strategic guidance. My phone buzzed with another text from Mom. Making pancakes this morning and thinking about when you were little. Remember how Dad used to flip them, so high they'd stick to the ceiling. Love you, sweetheart. And the innocent nostalgia in her message felt like a knife twisting in my chest because she was still carrying tender memories of a man who was actively working to destroy her sanity while she made breakfast alone in a house that had become her prison, unaware that every happy memory she cherished was being used against her by someone who'd turned love into a weapon of mass destruction. The key felt heavier in my hand as I thought about the different ways this confrontation could unfold. I could present the evidence calmly and give Dad a chance to explain himself, though what possible explanation could justify 8 years of systematic torture disguised as property management? I could explode with the rage that had been building in my chest since I discovered his name on the ownership documents, letting 28 years of accumulated daddy's girl worship transform into the kind of fury that leaves relationships burned to ash. Or I could try to broker some kind of peace treaty that would end Mom's suffering without completely destroying my relationship with the man who'd shaped my understanding of what fathers were supposed to be, though the naivety of that hope felt like another form of self-torture designed to protect me from accepting the full scope of his betrayal. The morning sun reflected off the building's glass facade, casting shadows that reminded me of the way light used to filter through our kitchen windows when I was 8 years old, and believed that parents were fundamentally good people who made mistakes sometimes, but never deliberately hurt the ones they were supposed to protect. Back when I thought divorce was something that happened to other families and my parents' love was permanent as the mountains Dad pointed out during our summer camping trips when he'd tell me stories about geological time and how some things lasted forever while others eroded slowly under pressure that wasn't visible until the damage was irreversible. I could picture Mom sitting at her kitchen table right now, probably reading the violation notice that had arrived yesterday demanding she repaint her front door for the 3rd time this year, her shoulders curved with the weight of trying to understand why her simple existence had become such a source of conflict with people she'd never met. Why every attempt to comply with their demands was met with new requirements that seemed designed to prove she was fundamentally inadequate as a tenant, as a woman, as a human being worthy of basic respect and dignity in the place she called home. The brass key's metal had absorbed my body heat until it felt like a small furnace against my palm, and I realized I'd been gripping it so tightly that my knuckles had gone white with the effort of holding on to something solid while my world crumbled around the edges. While everything I believed about family and love, and the basic goodness of people I trusted revealed itself to be as substantial as morning mist that disappears the moment sunlight touches it with the harsh clarity of absolute truth. I knocked on Dad's condo door at 8:15 a.m. with the brass key clutched in my left hand and a manila folder of property records pressed against my chest like armor, my right hand trembling so violently I had to steady it against the doorframe while I waited for him to answer. The sound of his approaching footsteps through the hardwood hallway, triggering a flood of cellular memories from childhood mornings when those same footsteps had meant safety and breakfast and someone who would protect me from every monster in the world instead of becoming the very thing I needed protection from. Key alongside evidence papers. These had become my weapons in a war I'd never wanted to fight. The brass key representing 20 years of Mom's faithful love and the legal documents representing 8 years of his calculated cruelty. Two symbols that together told the complete story of how a marriage had died and been reborn as something far more sinister than simple divorce, far more destructive than the clean break both parties had pretended to want when they'd signed papers that were supposed to set them free from each other's influence forever. The door opened to reveal Robert Thompson in his weekend uniform of pressed khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Mom's monthly grocery budget, his face brightening with genuine surprise and what looked like fatherly joy at seeing his daughter on his doorstep without warning, the same expression he'd worn when I'd surprised him for Father's Day visits during college. Back when I still believed that showing up unannounced was a gift instead of an ambush that would destroy everything we built together over 28 years of shared history and manufactured trust. "Ashley, sweetheart, what a wonderful surprise," he said, stepping aside to let me into the condo that smelled like expensive coffee and his new girlfriend's perfume. The kind of floral scent that was too young for a woman in her 40s, but perfectly appropriate for someone trying to erase the memory of 23 years spent married to a kindergarten teacher who wore drugstore lotion and had never owned anything that couldn't be purchased with a teacher's salary and careful budgeting. I followed him into the living room where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the golf course he joined after the divorce, using money he'd claimed not to have during the settlement negotiations, and I noticed that every surface was decorated with photographs of his new life. Him and Rebecca at wine tastings, vacation trips to places he'd never taken Mom. Professional portraits that looked like advertisements for the kind of happiness that comes from erasing your previous existence and pretending the first 23 years of your adult life had been a practice round for the real thing. The manila folder felt slippery in my sweaty palm as I turned to face him, watching his expression shift from paternal warmth to cautious concern as he registered the tension radiating from my body, the way I was holding myself like someone preparing for combat. The manila folder clutched against my chest like evidence in a murder trial where the victim was still breathing, but dying slowly from wounds that couldn't be seen by anyone who wasn't looking closely enough to notice the way Joy had drained from her eyes over the course of 8 years spent believing she was fighting an invisible enemy instead of the man who'd once promised to love and protect her until death did them part. "Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected given that my hands were shaking hard enough to make the papers rustle like autumn leaves in a windstorm. "We need to talk about Mom's landlord situation." His face went carefully blank in the way I remembered from childhood moments when he'd been caught in some minor deception, forgetting to pick me up from soccer practice, spending grocery money on lottery tickets. Small lies that had seemed harmless then, but now felt like training wheels for the kind of systematic deception that required corporate filing fees and shell companies and 8 years of sustained psychological warfare against someone who'd never learned to fight dirty because she'd been raised to believe that good people don't weaponize bureaucracy against those they're supposed to love. I opened the manila folder and spread the property records across his glass coffee table like tarot cards predicting doom, watching his eyes track across the documents that spelled out his ownership of 247 Maple Street, his connection to Midwest Property Solutions, the email threads where he'd specifically requested that violation notices be timed to coincide with emotionally significant dates. Each piece of paper a building block in the case that would transform him from father to defendant in a trial where the only possible verdict was guilty of crimes against the human heart that were legal but morally unconscionable. The brass key caught the morning sunlight streaming through his windows as I placed it gently on top of the property deed, the metal gleaming like a small accusation that connected his current luxury to Mom's systematic destruction, and I watched his face cycle through surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally a kind of cold resignation that told me he'd always known this moment would come, that somewhere in the back of his mind he'd been preparing for the day when his daughter would discover what kind of man her father really was beneath the carefully maintained facade of concern and respectability that had fooled everyone, including himself, into believing his revenge was justified rather than monstrous. "Ashley, you don't understand." Dad's voice trailed off as he stared at the property record spread across his coffee table like evidence in a murder trial, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Not the controlled anger I remembered from childhood arguments or the manufactured sadness he'd worn during divorce proceedings, but something rawer and more desperate. The look of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble under the weight of documentation he couldn't deny or explain away with the smooth corporate speak he'd perfected over 8 years of hiding behind shell companies and property management proxies. The morning sunlight streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated every line on his face as 28 years of father-daughter trust evaporated in the space between his admission and my horrified recognition that the man who taught me to ride a bike and check my oil had been capable of psychological warfare, so sophisticated it required business licenses and third-party management companies to execute properly, transforming our childhood home into a weapon designed to destroy. The woman who'd given him the best years of her life while he maintained plausible deniability through corporate letterhead and anonymous violation notices. I watched him pick up the brass key with hands that shook almost imperceptibly, the same fingers that had once braided my hair for school pictures and built me a treehouse in our backyard, now handling the symbol of Mom's faithful love like it was evidence of his own monstrosity, and I could see him calculating whether to deny everything, whether to try charm or manipulation, or the daddy's girl affection that had always been his secret weapon when he needed to redirect my attention away from uncomfortable questions about his choices and their consequences for people who trusted him to act with basic human decency. "She left me, Ashley," he said finally, his voice carrying a whine I'd never heard before, a petulant tone that reminded me of playground bullies trying to justify their cruelty by blaming their victims for existing, for having something they wanted, for daring to believe they deserved better treatment than whatever punishment their tormentors decided to inflict. After everything I gave her, everything I provided, she walked away like 23 years meant nothing, like the house and the life and the security I built for our family was just something she could discard when she got bored with being married to someone who actually worked for a living instead of playing with finger paints and reading picture books to other people's children. The bitterness in his voice was so thick I could taste it in the air between us, metallic and sharp like blood from a bitten tongue, and I realized I was finally seeing the man Mom had been trying to protect me from during those careful Sunday phone calls where she deflected my questions about why their marriage had really ended, why someone who'd seemed so devoted to family had suddenly decided that destroying his ex-wife was more important than preserving his relationship with his daughter. His justifications poured out like water from a broken dam. How Mom had been emotionally unavailable during his midlife crisis, how she'd let herself go after I graduated high school, how she'd never appreciated the sacrifices he'd made to provide for our family, how she'd forced him to find companionship elsewhere because she was more interested in her students than her husband. Each accusation revealing layers of resentment he'd apparently been nurturing for years while I believed our family was happy, while Mom had been making his favorite dinner every night and asking about his day at the manufacturing plant where he'd been passed over for promotion twice in 5 years. "You have no idea what it was like, Ashley, watching her give everything to those kids at school while I came home to someone who acted like I was an inconvenience, like providing for her was something she was entitled to instead of something she should be grateful for," he continued, his voice rising with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from people who've spent so long justifying their cruelty that they've convinced themselves they're actually the victim in situations where they hold all the power and choose to use it for destruction rather than healing. I could smell his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of his new girlfriend's coffee brewing in the kitchen, creating an olfactory reminder that he'd built this new life on the foundation of Mom's systematic destruction. That every luxury in this condo had been purchased with money he could have used to leave her alone instead of buying our childhood home specifically to weaponize it against someone who still kept his favorite coffee mug in her kitchen cabinet because throwing it away felt like admitting their love had been meaningless. The brass key gleamed on his coffee table between us like a small accusation, and I watched him avoid looking at it while he continued his litany of grievances, his attempts to paint himself as a man who'd been driven to extraordinary measures by an ungrateful wife who'd failed to appreciate his sacrifices, who'd somehow deserve 8 years of psychological torture because she'd committed the unforgivable sin of believing she could be happy without him, that she could build a life where his approval wasn't the center around which everything else revolved. She needed to learn, he said, his eyes finally meeting mine with a coldness that made my blood freeze in my veins, that walking away from someone who provided for her, who gave her everything she ever wanted, has consequences. That you can't just discard people when they become inconvenient. The stranger sitting across from me wore my father's face, but spoke with the voice of someone I'd never met. Someone who'd been hiding behind paternal affection and manufactured concern while orchestrating a revenge fantasy that had consumed 8 years of his life and nearly destroyed Mom's will to exist in a world where faceless landlords could make arbitrary rules designed to prove she was fundamentally inadequate as a human being deserving of basic respect and dignity. The complete timeline of his revenge unfolded like a master class in psychological warfare as Dad walked me through 8 years of calculated cruelty with the proud precision of an architect describing his greatest creation, explaining how he'd researched landlord-tenant law for months before purchasing the house to ensure every violation notice and rent increase would be legally bulletproof while remaining emotionally devastating, how he'd specifically chosen property management companies with reputations for aggressive enforcement because he wanted Mom to feel like she was fighting an entire system instead of one man's personal vendetta disguised as corporate policy. Emotional timeline of sacrifices, that's what he'd created without realizing it. A detailed record of how Mom had given up pieces of herself every month to comply with increasingly absurd demands that were designed to be impossible to satisfy completely, each violation teaching her that her best efforts would never be enough, that she was fundamentally flawed as a tenant, as a woman, as a human being who deserved to exist in peace in the place she called home. He described with chilling detail how he'd escalated the harassment during Mom's most vulnerable moments, doubling her rent the month after her mother died because he knew she'd be emotionally fragile and financially strained from funeral expenses, filing eviction notices every Christmas morning because he remembered how much she'd loved decorating our house for the holidays, timing violation citations to arrive on the anniversary of my graduation because he wanted to taint her proudest memories of watching me succeed despite the chaos of their divorce. The systematic nature of his cruelty became clear as he explained his filing system, spreadsheets tracking her payment dates, emotional calendar with significant anniversaries marked for maximum impact, detailed notes about her daily routines, gathered through drive-by surveillance. He conducted himself during lunch breaks from his job at the manufacturing plant where he'd spent 8 years pretending to be a normal divorced dad instead of someone who was slowly murdering his ex-wife's spirit. Through bureaucratic torture disguised as property management, I learned that every garden gnome violation had been personally triggered by him driving past the house and seeing evidence that Mom was still trying to create beauty in a space he transformed into her prison. That every noise complaint had been filed after he'd sat in his car outside her windows, listening for sounds of life and happiness that needed to be crushed before they could take root and grow into the kind of contentment that might help her heal from the systematic destruction he'd been inflicting since the day their divorce was finalized. The rent increases followed a pattern of psychological manipulation that revealed how intimately he still knew her financial situation despite 8 years of supposed separation. He'd somehow accessed her teacher's salary information and calculated exactly how much money she could afford to lose each month while still maintaining the bare minimum survival, keeping her perpetually on the edge of financial collapse without pushing her into complete destitution that might force her to seek help from family or friends who could investigate her landlord situation more thoroughly than she'd been able to manage alone. His monitoring system included hiring private investigators to document her daily activities, installing security cameras that violated her privacy under the guise of property protection, and maintaining contact with neighbors who unknowingly provided intelligence about her emotional state, her social interactions, her attempts to build a life independent of his influence and control. The violation notices weren't random harassment but carefully crafted psychological attacks designed to target her deepest insecurities. Citations for excessive sentimentality, when she displayed family photos in windows visible from the street. Fines for unauthorized emotional expression, when neighbors reported hearing her cry through thin walls. Demands that she remove the bird bath because it attracted excessive wildlife activity, even though he'd installed it himself during their marriage as an anniversary gift that was supposed to represent their love growing stronger with each passing year. He'd weaponized every shared memory, every moment of tenderness from their 23-year marriage, turning their history into ammunition for a war she didn't know she was fighting against, an enemy who wore the mask of anonymous corporate authority, while targeting her with the precision that only comes from intimate knowledge of someone's vulnerabilities, dreams, fears, and the specific triggers that could reduce her to tears in the privacy of a home that had become her psychological torture chamber. The most devastating revelation was how he'd used my own visits against her, timing his most cruel harassment to occur immediately after I'd left town so that she'd be isolated with her pain, unable to share her suffering with the one person who might have recognized his fingerprints on her systematic destruction, ensuring that every moment of connection we shared was immediately followed by escalated cruelty that would leave her questioning whether she deserved love or support from anyone, whether she was somehow fundamentally broken in ways that justified the treatment she received from faceless authorities who seemed determined to prove she was inadequate as a human being worthy of basic dignity and respect in the place she'd been paying rent to live peacefully for 8 years. "Stop," I said, my voice cutting through his self-justifying monologue like a blade, the brass key trembling in my hand as I stood up from his leather couch and faced the stranger, who wore my father's face but spoke with the voice of someone who'd spent 8 years convincing himself that psychological torture was a reasonable response to the perceived crime of being left by someone who'd simply grown tired of being treated like a possession instead of a partner. Sometimes love means choosing sides, and in that moment I realized that protecting Mom from continued destruction mattered more than preserving whatever remained of my relationship with a man who could describe 8 years of systematic cruelty with the same pride other fathers used when talking about their children's achievements, their golf handicaps, their retirement plans that involve something other than monitoring their ex-wives' emotional calendars for opportunities to inflict maximum damage through corporate letterhead and shell companies designed to hide the identity of tormentors who were too cowardly to sign their own names to the violence they'd chosen to inflict. I pulled out my phone and started recording, watching his face shift from self-righteous explanation to panic as he realized I was documenting his confession, that every word he'd spoken in the past hour would be preserved as evidence of crimes against the human heart that were legal but morally indefensible. Ammunition I could use to protect Mom from future harassment and possibly pursue legal action against the property management companies who'd been complicit in his revenge fantasy without understanding they were facilitating domestic abuse disguised as landlord-tenant disputes. "Ashley, put that away! You're being dramatic," he said, reaching for my phone with the same controlling gesture I'd seen him use with Mom during their final fights, but I stepped back and kept recording, needing him to understand that his power over our family had ended the moment I discovered his name on those property documents. That I was no longer the daddy's girl who would keep his secrets or make excuses for his choices or pretend that his version of love was anything other than possession dressed up in the language of provision and protection. The words poured out of me with surgical precision as I explained exactly what was going to happen. He would immediately contact Midwest Property Solutions and terminate Mom's lease with 6 months' notice and no penalties, allowing her to find alternative housing without the financial strain of breaking an agreement that had been designed to trap her in a cycle of compliance and violation that served no purpose except his psychological satisfaction. He would transfer ownership of 247 Maple Street to Mom without compensation, not because she wanted to live there anymore, but because it was the only gesture that could begin to repair 8 years of damage he'd inflicted through systematic harassment disguised as property management. The only way to give her back some measure of control over a situation where she'd been powerless against an enemy she couldn't identify or confront directly. If he refused these terms, I would send copies of his confession to Mom, to his employer, to his new girlfriend, to every property management company in Wisconsin, to anyone who needed to understand what kind of man could maintain a facade of respectability while orchestrating psychological warfare against someone who'd never learned to fight dirty because she'd been raised to believe that good people don't weaponize bureaucracy against those they're supposed to love. I watched his face cycle through anger, calculation, and finally a kind of resigned understanding that his choices had consequences beyond his ability to control or manipulate, that sometimes the children we raise to be moral and strong will choose morality over loyalty when forced to pick between protecting their mother and enabling their father's continued cruelty disguised as justified revenge. "You're destroying our family," he said, his voice carrying the whine of someone who'd never learned that families are destroyed by those who choose cruelty over kindness, not by those who refuse to enable systematic abuse, not by daughters who love their mothers enough to confront fathers who've transformed love into a weapon of mass destruction designed to prove that walking away from marriage has consequences that extend far beyond legal documents and property settlements. I told him that our family had been destroyed 8 years ago when he decided that revenge mattered more than healing, that punishing Mom was more important than preserving his relationship with his daughter, that proving his power through systematic torture was worth sacrificing every good memory we'd shared during the 28 years when I believed he was the kind of man who protected people instead of destroying them through bureaucratic warfare disguised as legitimate business practices. The brass key felt warm in my palm as I made my choice explicit. I would choose Mom's safety over his comfort, her peace over our shared history, her right to exist without harassment over his need to feel powerful through the systematic destruction of someone who'd committed the unforgivable crime of believing she deserved better treatment than he'd been willing to provide during the final years of their marriage when his resentment had grown larger than his love. 3 months later, I stood in Mom's new apartment kitchen watching her make pancakes for the first time since I'd confronted Dad with the property records that had shattered our family's carefully maintained fiction that divorce was clean and simple instead of the messy, ongoing negotiation between love and revenge that defines so many broken relationships, where children become unwilling referees in wars they never understood were being fought. What worth do we overlook in others? The question had haunted me since that morning in Dad's condo when I'd watched 28 years of father-daughter worship crumble under the weight of documented evidence that the man who taught me to check my oil and balance my checkbook was capable of psychological warfare so sophisticated it required business licenses and shell companies to execute properly, transforming our understanding of family into something more complex and painful than the simple narrative of good parents and grateful children that I'd carried through my entire adult life until circumstance forced me to choose between enabling cruelty and protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. The brass key now sat in a place of honor on Mom's new mantle, no longer a symbol of lost dreams, but a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to let go of love even when it's been weaponized against us. Even when holding on to memories feels like carrying broken glass that cuts deeper with every step we take toward healing and forgiveness that may never come but remains the only path forward that doesn't require us to become the kind of people who use bureaucracy as ammunition in wars against those we're supposed to love. Mom's new landlord was an elderly woman named Mrs. Chun who brought her homemade soup when she had a cold and never charged late fees if rent was a day behind, who treated her tenants like human beings deserving of dignity instead of sources of revenue to be maximized through systematic harassment and arbitrary rule enforcement, proving that not all power is corrupted by those who wield it, that some people understand that authority is a responsibility to protect rather than an opportunity to control and dominate those who depend on their mercy for basic survival. I never spoke to Dad again after that morning when I'd recorded his confession and given him 48 hours to transfer the house deed to Mom and terminate her nightmare lease with the property management company that had been unknowingly complicit in 8 years of domestic abuse disguised as landlord-tenant disputes. Though I heard through family friends that he'd moved to Arizona with his girlfriend and taken early retirement from the manufacturing plant where he'd spent his lunch breaks, conducting surveillance on the woman he'd once promised to love and protect until death parted them. The legal transfer of 247 Maple Street had taken 6 weeks and cost Mom nothing except the emotional labor of deciding whether to sell the house where we'd been happy or rent it to a young family who would fill its rooms with laughter and birthday parties and Christmas mornings that weren't tainted by the knowledge that home can become a weapon when wielded by someone who confuses love with possession, protection with control, provision with the right to inflict consequences on those who dare. To believe they deserve better treatment than whatever their providers decide to grant or withhold based on compliance with expectations that may be unreasonable, impossible, or designed specifically to ensure failure and ongoing punishment. Watching Mom flip pancakes with steady hands for the first time in years, I understood that healing isn't about forgetting the damage or forgiving those who caused it, but about recognizing that our worth isn't determined by how others choose to treat us. That dignity is something we carry inside ourselves regardless of whether it's acknowledged or respected by those who claim to love us, while systematically working to destroy our confidence in our own value as human beings deserving of basic respect and kindness. The smell of vanilla and butter filled her small kitchen as she hummed softly while cooking. The same tune she'd sung during Saturday mornings when I was 8 and believed that parents were fundamentally good people who might make mistakes but would never deliberately hurt their children or use intimate knowledge of someone's vulnerabilities as ammunition in psychological warfare designed to prove that leaving them had consequences extending far beyond legal documents and property settlements. If after hearing Ashley's story you feel there's someone in your family you haven't truly seen, don't wait 7 years like she did to recognize that protecting those we love sometimes means confronting those who hurt them, even when the person causing the pain wears a familiar face and speaks with a voice that once meant safety instead of danger disguised as concern and legitimate authority that was actually revenge dressed up in corporate letterhead and shell companies designed to hide the identity of tormentors who were too cowardly to sign their own names to the violence they'd chosen to inflict through systematic harassment and bureaucratic warfare. Tell me in the comments, is there someone in your life you've underestimated, someone whose worth you've overlooked because you were distracted by more obvious forms of strength and success that don't require the quiet courage it takes to survive systematic destruction while maintaining enough love in your heart to protect those who can't protect themselves from the people who should be keeping them safe? And don't forget to tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing where my daughters and mothers are located around the world, where stories like this are being recognized and shared by people who understand that sometimes the most valuable person in any family is the one who seems invisible until crisis forces us to choose between comfort and courage, between maintaining convenient fictions and protecting those whose only crime was believing they deserve to be treated with basic human dignity by those who claim to love them most.